So, great pleasure to be here. I generally work around the corner as director of the China Centre, and therefore it's a privilege to be able to come into CSOX for a kind of alternative view of how the region that I normally deal with is dealt with by others a bit closer geographically to where we are at the moment. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our two speakers tonight, talking about China and its role in Southeast Europe, more broadly speaking. We'll have two speakers, each doing 20 to 25 minutes of talk, followed by, I hope, a lively discussion with you, the audience here tonight. So our first speaker will be Jens Bastian. He's now an independent economic analyst based in Athens and Stuttgart. And in particular, China's expanding investment and bank lending footprint in Europe is an area of particular expertise. He's been a consultant to the EBRD and written about China's infrastructure engagement in Southeast Europe. He'd also worked by appointment to the European Commission as a member of the task force for Greece. And you have been a senior research associate, Jens, with ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy in Athens, for the last decade, in fact, since 2009, as well as, of course, having history, as they say, with St. Anthony's College right here. And our second speaker, Igor Rogelja, is that right? Exactly. Igor Rogelja did his doctorate at SOAS, a sentence that I hope that people will be able to utter in future.
Yes,
but SOAS is, I always think the condition of SOAS, which is an institution currently which is slightly suffering on the brink of a major financial disaster, is what I believe the comedian Ennio Flaiano said about Italy in the 1960s, that its condition was fatal but not serious. So we will hope that SOAS does slightly better than that. Igor's work is on urban redevelopment in China and Taiwan, and he is focusing now on transnational infrastructure on the Eurasian landmass. He's recently been a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute, where he was working on the subject which he will tell us more about today, which is coal-powered plants in the coal power plants in the Balkans. And you're currently teaching, I think, in the Empire of Kerry Brown, is that right?
That is correct.
Teaching Chinese politics at King's London. So two wonderful speakers. I will, if I may, turn straight over to you, Jens, to lead us off.
Well, thank you very much, Rana, David, Othon, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but also Julie for inviting me. I'm happy to see Calypso, Michael Taylor, colleague at Oxford Analytica, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. For me, it feels like, and Rana, you just alluded to it, to coming home. Yes, I feel St. Anthony's is close to my heart, Oxford, where I have lived and worked for some years. Therefore, I'm happy to come back and to meet all of you. I would like to today, is this working correctly now? Yes. I'm going to talk today in my presentation to you, trying to draw attention to what I would call, and it is a term that maybe you're already familiar with, to a so-called non-EU external actor who is increasingly engaged. And when I mean engaged, it means who is invested, and not only in financial terms, as I will highlight, who is invested in Southeastern Europe. Now, I gather from the program that David gave me a few moments ago that, for example, last week, Othon presented on another external actor, that was Russia. I want to concentrate today on China, a non-EU external actor that is very busy, as I will hopefully explain to you clearly, very busy in the EU's backyard. Now, first of all, let me highlight some conceptual markers, and for those who are familiar with the region and its naming, I do want to apologize, but I cannot find a better map right now. Unfortunately, it's not updated with regard to North Macedonia. That sometimes, coming from Greece, is an issue of importance. Nevertheless, take my word, I'm aware of it. I couldn't find a better map. If you can identify one, please come forward. I want to highlight some conceptual markers. What is China doing and with what means? The first is that I want to emphasize that across different countries of the region, you can identify what I would call anchor investments. They're catalysts. They're in many ways icebreakers, which are, for example, in the port of Piraeus in Athens, Greece, an example of 10 years ago, China making its first presence felt. And through that kind of an icebreaker, you can gradually see, and I will highlight it in a moment with an example, how this is expanding across other sectors and across other countries. And this leads me to my second conceptual aspect, that I argue that what China is doing is actually building clusters of investment in different sectors. In order to do that, China needs considerable financial firepower. It does so with different means, either equity investments, minority or majority shareholding, or it also does so with infrastructure lending through its state-owned policy banks. These three aspects, anchor investments, serving as icebreakers, building clusters, and using different financial means. The question I ask myself, and it is one that I'd also invite you to discuss with me, I am not yet sure, not yet convinced myself, if we can call all that a strategy. Or is it opportunistic? Identifying opportunity in sectors, in countries, but can we argue that China has a regional strategy for Southeastern Europe? The jury on that, in my view, is open. Therefore, I am not yet fully convinced that we are at that point of strategic policymaking of China in the region. I'm happy to be challenged or corrected on that issue. Now, I told you anchor investments and building clusters of investments. And I'd like to highlight this in the area of maritime investments that Greece has undertaken in the course of the better part of 13 years. You can see here, starting in Egypt and all the way to recently in Bulgaria, how China, mainly through the state-owned shipping company COSCO, has invested across the region, but not only the ones I highlighted in yellow regarding Southeastern Europe, but also extending from there into other countries of Europe. What you can see here is a maritime network in the making. And it is one that is not finished, it is one that is not speculative, and it is long-term. It includes majority shareholdings in some countries like Greece. It includes in other countries like in Bulgaria, modernization, upgrading of port facilities. But it is, and that's why I use the term in my view, it is clustering investments. It starts in a country, in a sector, and then over time it builds as a cluster. You can also observe that, for example, in the energy sector, the manner in which Chinese companies have invested in different parts of Europe, South, Central, Eastern, or Western Europe. Now, in order to do that, I mentioned a few moments ago that China needs considerable financial firepower. With that, I mean that China is exporting capital to the region. And this capital is arriving in Southeastern Europe and specifically also in the Western Balkans. And I've highlighted here from 2013 until last year what, for example, various Chinese banks have provided in terms of infrastructure lending to individual countries and different kinds of projects, be they transport infrastructure like in Montenegro, be they the building of an industrial park in Belgrade, or be they environmentally focused projects, coal-fired power plants that Rana was referring to and that Igor will address in much greater detail. What you can see here are, in my view, two things. One, let me briefly highlight the lending arrangements. Many of these projects include 20-year repayment periods, favorable for countries subject to that. You don't necessarily get that on international capital markets today. 5-year grace period, very helpful for individual countries. Often the interest rate is fixed over the duration of the loan at 2%. And it is backed by collateral such as real estate. This is important, this last point, that many of these lending arrangements, controversial as they are, include sovereign guarantees. That means you shift the credit risk to the country. That has created a debate under the term debt trap diplomacy. And this is most acute, this debate, and I think also visible in substance, if a small country like Montenegro has an exposure close to €1 billion US dollars regarding only one project in infrastructure highway construction vis-à-vis China. But it is not only that Chinese companies are investing and lending to the region. And it is not only, as I highlighted in this previous slide, that with this lending, you can actually argue that the countries in the region are diversifying their sources of finance. They're reaching out to China, which they had not done 10 years ago. In some cases, not even 5 years ago. They're moving away from an exclusive focus on Europe. So that's a diversification in one direction. But it actually works both ways. And I'd like to highlight here something that is increasingly an issue in the region. And that is that Chinese companies are bidding for EU projects and are winning the tenders. And the game changer there, the most symbolic development, is the construction of a bridge in Croatia that links different parts of Croatia in the southern part of the country, close to the Bosnia-Herzegovina border. This is a project where the Croatian authorities have twice awarded the same project to a Chinese consortium, and it is 85% co-financed by the European Commission. And the Chinese are winning the tenders and are able to underbid European companies. This raises two questions, because it's not only happening in Croatia, it is also happening with regard to the European Investment Bank and the EBRD in London, in Bosnia, and in Greece, that you have to start asking, A, China itself is diversifying its own sources of capital. It is in a way Europeanizing it, in cooperation with European institutions. In my view, what is China doing there? It is building reputational capital vis-à-vis European financing institutions. On the other hand, it also asks, if Croatian companies award this to Chinese companies, do we need to reconsider, and it is a debate that is taking place in Brussels, EU procurement regulation. If Chinese companies who are state-subsidized companies now start winning EU tenders because they underbid their competitors. This leads me to a further dimension of the European footprint of China. It's not only active in lending in terms of anchor investments, in terms of cluster building. It's actually also active in institution building competition. Through the so-called 17+1 platform, which until last year was called 16+1. The name changed because at the summit in Dubrovnik, 16 countries plus China turned into 17+1 because Greece joined that network. The interesting element here is the following, that You can see it as a competition to other institutions. In particular, there are voices in Berlin, there are voices in Paris, in Brussels, who are saying, are you actually competing with us in the region with this kind of a network that you are establishing and even expanding? It is also interesting to argue who is currently not invited or willing to join the 17+1. Turkey is not a member, neither is Ukraine, and Kosovo cannot join the 17+1. Here China is explicitly on the Serbian position regarding the non-recognition of Kosovo. And it is, in my view, uncharacteristically undiplomatic there to actually voice that very publicly. So there is, in the region, many countries are trying to have close relationships of different kinds with China. There's one country that is systematically excluded. That's Kosovo. There are two issues that are, in my view, right now challenging for China regarding this 17+1 platform. One is that I mentioned a few moments ago, it is building reputational capital vis-à-vis European institutions. But then you can ask, is this a competition to these institutions? What are you trying, what is the messaging that you're sending here? Or can you try and synchronize? Can you try and identify areas of cooperation between 17+1 and EU initiatives, for example, in the transport sector? But it also creates other challenges. The 17+1 is about bilateral cooperation with China. It is about the expectation regarding investments and lending by individual countries. And it is today about the management of these expectations. There are first signs that there are countries that are starting to be disillusioned. How much can China indeed deliver on the ground and not only on paper? These summits are held every year. This year in April they are planned to be held. It would be the 9th in Beijing. This is the first time now that I will address the virus. There's a very large possibility that this summit will have to be postponed for the first time. This leads me to my last point on the EU-China aspect of this relationship. There are, as I briefly mentioned a moment ago, various areas where both the EU and China already cooperate, and where you can say there are tangible results. There is, for example, a connectivity platform. They do coordinate certain transport projects between what in EU parlance is called TENT, the so-called Trans-European Transport Network, and how it fits into the Belt and Road Initiative of China. They have published a joint paper on the Internet of Things, where they try to highlight, for example, common standards in the security of data. This is progress. But there are also areas where China is expecting more from the EU, and the EU is holding back. You can see that in the coveted status that China still has not received the green light from the EU inside the WTO to be recognized as a market economy. Equally, since 2014, China and the EU are negotiating, some say endlessly negotiating, a comprehensive agreement on investment, which is still not forthcoming, and I don't even see it on the horizon. And since April of last year, you can see a new initiative that the EU has brought through its regulatory capacity under the term investment screening. EU-wide regulations which member states have a number of years to adapt and translate into national legislation. The investment screening doesn't include at all the name China, but you read the legislation, the regulation, it's like a firewall against China. And the rhetoric is changing. Here in particular, how the European Commission now communicates in public through policy papers its definition of a relationship with China. And I've highlighted here the different terms that they are using in the same communication. A partner in negotiations with regard to different objectives, a competitor, a systemic rival. If one is among you familiar with EU language, EU speak, this is unusually clear. This is new, this is different vis-à-vis China. There's a change in tone, but there's also, regarding the points before that, there's a change in substance. One cannot ignore that. Let me, going to the home stretch of my presentation, highlight other aspects of what China is doing. You cannot invest, you cannot try and provide lending without also trying, in my view, to shape the narrative. And it's not only about bricks and mortar. It's not only about building highways and bridges or modernizing ports or acquiring these. It is also about what I would call China's soft power footprint, which is expanding. And I've highlighted here for you, just in the course of the past 14 years, some countries even have more than one so-called Confucius institutes across the region. They are expanding, they are mushrooming, and these are institutes that are administered by China's education ministry. They are paid regarding the operational costs, the textbooks, the language courses, the training, and so on and so forth by China. China is also financing scholarships, chairs, academic chairs. There are bilateral cooperation agreements in the region with think tanks that have been established, for example, in Prague and in Budapest. What is not addressed in these Confucius institutes is what I call China's 3 T's. That is Tibet, that is Taiwan, and that is Tiananmen. But there are also other avenues of cooperation that are emerging between China and countries in the region. You will be possibly surprised if you had traveled to Zagreb or to Belgrade in the summer of last year, sometimes all of a sudden finding yourself on central squares in these cities and seeing they don't look like Serbian policemen. They are from China. These are policemen, policewomen from China who are being sent to these countries. The official version is that they will help Chinese tourists in these countries to adapt, to move about, to understand where they are. And it makes sense in a way to me if it would be restricted to Belgrade and Zagreb. But it is not. There are also Chinese policemen and women who are appearing in areas like Smederevo in Serbia, where the Chinese have invested, but where I have not seen a Chinese tourist yet. It tells you something about an expanding small footprint in an area of security management. It may be something that opens a wider window into other areas in the future. And I've put together for you, because it's an issue that attracts great attention also in Britain, what is the major Chinese telecommunications company, Huawei, doing in southeastern Europe. And I've highlighted here its, for example, participation in the 17+1 network. It has there placed the so-called 1000 Dreams program. This is interesting if you look at the details. It is to train 1,000 ICT talents across Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe in the country itself. You could say, fine. It could also be a recruiting tool. Many of these people may not want to work in that country, but actually transfer to China. You can see how in Greece or in Serbia, Huawei is active in different areas, be it 5G, be it the modernization of internet or something that is receiving increased international attention, and that is the so-called smart or safe city projects that are popping up in Belgrade and in Sarajevo. These are smart city projects which, if you look at the details, and they're difficult to come by, it's partly a rather intransparent issue. It is about how Huawei is implementing comprehensive supervision projects, installing cameras, management systems, public safety systems, and they're not only about traffic monitoring. They can go further than that. My last slide, and I've been given the sign, time is of the essence. What does, in my view, China hold in Southeastern Europe and for Southeastern Europe in the future? I think that it is clear the activities of China in the region are diversifying and will continue to branch out. It's not a single issue anymore, investing in ports. I think there are some countries where the focus is more, like Greece and Serbia, on investment, on equity investment. There are other countries where the focus is stronger on infrastructure lending, providing project finance, for example, in Bosnia or in Montenegro. But with these different sets of activities, ladies and gentlemen, China is also acquiring leverage. I mentioned a moment ago, yes, it has a responsibility also. It has to manage expectations. But it is also acquiring leverage. And there are first signs that it is prepared to use that leverage if something risks not going its way. Let me give you an example. It is not from Southeastern Europe, but from Central Europe. It's from Prague. A lawmaker from Prague recently announced that he would pay Taiwan a visit, an official visit. And the embassy in Prague, the Chinese embassy, reacted by, quote, sending a letter, Czech companies who have economic interests in China will pay a price for that visit. The visit didn't take place at the end. The pressure was there. The lawmaker couldn't make the visit for a tragic reason. He died before making it. But this is where I'm trying to say this is the first sign. Is China also prepared to use leverage in certain, let's call it, delicate policy areas? My final point is about what I said at the beginning regarding EU, non-EU external actors. You talked about Russia, we talk about China, we can see it with Turkey, we can see it with Gulf states. It's a more broader development in the region of Southeastern Europe. It's becoming a focal area of activities in different means of non-EU external actors. And what I observe in particular is that China and Russia are actually doing certain things hand in hand in the region of Southeastern Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much for an extremely comprehensive laying out of the fast-changing but fascinating situation in Southeast Europe. A lot of questions to ask on that. Before we do that, we'll go to our second presentation from Igor and hear about a more granular matter, so to speak, but a very important one. So let me hand over to you, Igor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jens, for this presentation. I think there's lots to discuss. There's lots where I agree on you, and also some points where I think we can really kind of engage in good discussion later on. So as Rana said, this is perhaps a little bit more of a granular view. I mean, this is the result of a research project which is still ongoing, that's running out of King's, also with my colleague Kostas Timonis, who's focusing more on Greece, as you might have guessed from the name. But I'm specifically looking more at the Western Balkans, and above all looking at various infrastructural financing. Broadly speaking, this can be kind of broken up into energy and transport. I think also Jens covered this quite extensively. Today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about both, but then I think then focusing more on questions of energy, particularly the financing of coal power plants, and sort of the consequences that this brings. So the reason why the presentation is called the synergy of failures is because this is essentially what we found. It is not about China coming in and forcing coal power down the throats of helpless Balkan states, but rather is a far more complex picture and far more complex dynamic, which includes not only China and the so-called host states, I'll be referring them as host states, but also includes civil society actors, local elite actors, and also the EU and various other EU level institutions. In the case of energy, particularly the so-called energy community, which is a treaty-based system very relevant for the Western Balkans. So, first of all, we started this kind of project thinking about, well, whether China is actually a new player or not, and if it is, what does that actually mean? In what way is it new? What is it about China that is perhaps specific? Obviously, our task was made somewhat easier because this became a very kind of topical issue fairly recently, actually. So there was lots of opinions being thrown around, lots of things written, and so on, and it attracted both negative and positive reactions. And it's interesting to see that the negative reactions are coming more or less from let's say EU, Northern European countries, or the most developed European countries, whereas the South, South Europe and Southeast, you had a kind of sense of optimism. Whether that is sustainable or not is a different question, but certainly at the time it still is. However, we also found, and particularly when I was looking at energy, I found that many of these sort of estimates and sort of opinions, rather, are based mainly on geostrategic considerations. So this question of is China influencing Southeast Europe? Is China a competitor to the EU, and so on? Is this a part of a grand plan? Rather than perhaps looking at also the agency of Balkan states. What do they want from China? Right. That's a question that was asked not quite as often. And this led us to then start talking about, well, what is Chinese about the Chinese capital? What are the specifics of it? On the surface, of course, one could say, well, the role of the state. And that is indeed something that we found over and over again. The fact that both the lenders, the contractors that work on these projects are mainly state-owned enterprises. And also the role of the Chinese embassies in the region as sort of power brokers between the host states and the interested Chinese companies is something that came up over and over again. But we still, even when we started looking at this, it was still not clear exactly in what ways actually China can influence local politics. And perhaps also importantly, is it successful in doing so? What kind of challenges does it face? And on one hand, you spoke about debt traps, that's one way to create leverage. But then there's a kind of flip side to that, which is this idea of entanglement. Is China getting tangled up in relations which perhaps it would rather avoid? So I approach this question really not trying so much to answer whether Chinese capital is detrimental to environmental protection, as I mentioned, looking mainly at energy and environment, but rather thinking about what are the ways in which the presence of Chinese capital is affecting very important transitions in the region, such as decarbonization, such as transparency, rule of law, financial feasibility of projects, things like that. And in order to do so, I looked at really kind of case-specific analyses. So to really focus on, okay, well, what has happened in this particular coal power plant? Because that's the idea behind this, was that by doing that, we might be able to establish some kind of comparative case. Why? Because this coal financing is not just happening in Southeast Europe, it's happening greatly in Vietnam, in Turkey, in South Asia, also in East Africa and so on. So there is a kind of scope for comparative work here to see whether these things always run in the same way, or whether there's something specific about the kind of synergies that are created in Southeast Europe. So really looking at the role of host states. On the other hand, you can also compare this to Western lenders. in Western, let's say also contractors. How do they work? How do they approach business in Southeast Europe? So in terms of like where this material came from, where it kind of stems from, both me and my kind of collaborator have done extensive field work. But we also organized a couple of workshops where we invited local stakeholders, from unions, environmentalists, local sort of activists, and so on. And we focused really on the Western Balkans region, as well as then inviting cases from other countries such as Slovenia and Greece. The reason being that we wanted to compare whether there's a difference between countries which are members of the EU and those which are not members of the EU. So that's why we kind of looked also at Slovenia, Croatia, Greece, and so on. So really, the aim was to discuss, what are the challenges that are perhaps emerging here? Why do they emerge? How is this interplay of actors perhaps causing them? And also, we had a sort of other agenda, which is really we wanted to also help build horizontal networks in the region itself. We found, particularly talking to trade unions, there's very little horizontal communication there. So it was very kind of rewarding to bring together people from the port in Piraeus and also the steelwork in Serbia and sort of an appliance maker in Slovenia to talk to each other about the experiences of having been taken over by a Chinese state-owned company. This is where it got a little bit trickier. Then we thought, well, we need to kind of select some cases, really. And to answer this kind of how question rather than whether this investment is detrimental, we actually chose the more controversial cases because we wanted to see when things go wrong, why do they go wrong? How? In what way? What kind of what is, let's say, the role of organizations such as the EU, of trade unions, of host states, and so on. So we really focused on, are these important big projects? So we're not kind of looking at really minor things. Looked at their environmental impact. We had a kind of sectoral variety. So there's coal power plants, the port in Piraeus, also some roads, and so on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we wanted to see across the kind of EU, non-EU divide as well. So the first one in Piraeus, what we kind of found here, and this is, I'm going to talk specifically more about the environmental aspect of it, is that COSCO, both in the first round of its entry, when it was only a concession holder rather than an owner, and then in the 2016 privatization, had a specific issue, which is that it had a very kind of own understanding of what environmental issues are all about. So it understood it as a matter of bilateral negotiation between COSCO and the Greek government in terms of, let's say, whether the environmental impact assessment should be completed or not, and what should go in it or not. And this, for a while, worked quite well under the governments in Greece between 08 and 15. So there was very little political will on the Greek side to enforce compliance. There was lots of pressure, of course, from the EU to privatize these assets very quickly. So this is a question that was sidelined, and this suited COSCO quite a lot. Then when the Syriza government came in, because they were also quite close to the union in Piraeus, they had a different view on things and started asking questions about, well, how will you complete this environmental impact assessment, and so on. And actually, COSCO failed several times. The impact assessment was rejected. It was kind of returned to COSCO to sort of do it again. And what we kind of saw from this is that essentially what we had here is not so much a lack of willingness on COSCO's part, but perhaps a lack of know-how, actually, on how to engage with this process, not as some sort of bureaucratic exercise that can just be rubber stamped by a compliant government, but actually a real environmental impact assessment that needs to involve civil society actors, that needs to involve consultation on the local level. None of this was actually done. So this we found was a really big kind of weak point in the way in which these Chinese investors address things. Then secondly, and this is actually a very similar story, this is a coal power plant in Serbia, Kostolac. So here you had a situation where, much like in Greece, the host state was very supportive of the project. This is a flagship project for the Serbian government, has been for a while, and so on. excuse me. So the Serbian government is really adamant on proceeding with this project. Furthermore, in order to actually create a legal framework for this, Serbia and China signed an infrastructural cooperation treaty, which sort of is a kind of template treaty, which was then used in other places in the Balkans as well, in terms of what are the responsibilities of each side. And the responsibility for things like environmental impact assessment rests squarely with the Serbian side, which of course, again, very much suits the Chinese contractor as well as the financier, which in this case is the China Exim Bank. I think China Exim is one of the largest financiers anyway. So this situation meant that, again, the Chinese side had to blindly trust the Serbian side to complete these assessments, which, again, it did not. Not only that, there was not just local environmental problems, there was also some transboundary aspect to this. This is a power plant that's very close to the Romanian border, and actually Romania lodged a complaint that this was not actually considered what the environmental impact would be across the border. So again, here we found that this is again a synergy of failures, i.e. that the Chinese side was blindly trusting the host state. The host state had very little interest in delaying the project with needless bureaucracy, and really it was up to civil society actors and then ultimately also Romania and the energy community to say, well, hold on, this is not entirely above board. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, with another coal power plant, Stanari, this was then an even more complicated story. So initially, this is very interestingly a coal power plant that's built by a private investor. So it's not the investor is not let's say the state utility. It's a private company called EFT. However, EFT being for the region large, but in the grand scheme of things, a pretty small company, couldn't provide the kind of guarantees that the China Development Bank needed for this kind of project to go ahead. So of course what EFT did is it arranged the Serbian entity, the Republika Srpska, to provide sovereign guarantees for what is essentially a private deal. So you really see the extent to which there's a kind of melding of these kind of business elites and local government elites that are very keen to provide the Chinese lenders with the kind of environment that they require. At the same time, though, the Chinese funder and the contractor were also quite accommodating of the requirements made by the Bosnian side. So initially, this was supposed to be a supercritical design of the coal power plant, fairly efficient. It was sold with much kind of pomp as the cleanest coal power plant in the Balkans and so on. Then it turns out this was too expensive, so the EFT lobbied the Chinese to actually reduce the efficiency and make it cheaper and of course less clean. So this was then built. This is one of the few ones that is actually already completed. The day it was completed, it would have already failed at emission standards of the EU. Yeah. So really it's a kind of a stranded asset already. Yeah. So this and this is to make matters worse, this is actually the most efficient coal power plant in Bosnia, and yet it's financially unsustainable without the kind of direct and indirect subsidies that it receives in terms of the pricing of electricity that it produces. Then we had an outlier, and this was an oil field in Albania. So this was initially bought from the Albanian national petroleum company by a Canadian company called Bankers Petroleum. They invested quite a lot. They're the largest employer, the largest private sector employer in Albania. And then this whole company was bought by GOJ, which is a Chinese company. And here, this was a bit of an outlier, and we found perhaps one of the reasons was that the Chinese investor was a private company with very little direct contact to the Albanian government, whereas actually the previous owner, Bankers, had very good relations with the Albanian government, apparently through the US Embassy, but this is something that is quite difficult to verify. What happened here is that the Chinese investor came in and started sort of increased the fracking operation, which was very controversial. It caused many earthquakes in the region, and of course there was a kind of civil society movement against this. So unlike many other civil society movements against, let's say, the coal power plants, which so far have not been very successful, this was a case of a successful, let's say, resistance. So in essence, what happened after a kind of series of events, including a hunger strike, a march to Tirana, and so on, the government actually instituted a moratorium on fracking, charged the company with damages, and seemingly sided with this kind of civil society movement. So we really saw that actually, in terms of the kind of variables that we might want to be looking at, the provenance of Chinese capital is quite important. Is this state-owned enterprise? Is this a private company? To what extent do they have links with the whole state government or not? And then here, more or less, we started thinking also about what is the role of the EU and also various EU-backed institutions here. They're really crucial context, but the role is quite ambivalent at best. So while they do provide regulatory standards, this isn't always something that would repel Chinese companies. I think, especially in the construction sector, the reason why so many Chinese companies want to work in the Western Balkans is because they get the best of both worlds. On one hand, they get very cooperative, compliant governments who don't care about things like public tenders and transparency. But on the other hand, they build to very high standards. So they can put this in their portfolio. We've built, this road that's part of the European transit network. And indeed, you mentioned the bridge in Croatia, in Pelješac. The same company that then got awarded this contract previously was awarded many contracts in Serbia and also Montenegro. It's the same company, it's China Road Bridge Corporation, which is doing all these things and sort of racking up its kind of, filling its CV with increasingly complex projects. So there's kind of conflicting normative priorities. On one hand, let's say with the case of Piraeus, also the privatization was very much pushed by the EU. And indeed, Costco was the only bidder, as far as I know.
Yeah, there was another one.
There was another one.
Mask from Denmark.
Okay, that's interesting. Then, in terms of, let's say, the coal power plants, often the only challenge that came from European institutions was not really on environmental standards, not on breaking, let's say, rules about emission standards and so on, but rather was on state aid. So it was on competition. Yeah. And this is again same now in Bosnia. Tuzla 7, again another Chinese finance project that just got approved recently, is being challenged by the energy community on grounds of state aid, not anything else. And lastly, there is a big infrastructure gap in the Balkans. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs upgrading, and there's not enough funds for it. So in many ways, and this is sort of something that was repeated to me, particularly in Serbia, where officials at the Ministry of Infrastructure were saying, well, the EU wants us to build all these roads. We kind of have to, but the Chinese are the only ones willing to pay for it. Right? So this is a kind of dynamic that was seen over and over and over again. So. What is the results of these kind of research? What do we find? We found that yes, we can provide a qualitative, careful yes to the question of whether Chinese capital poses specific environmental challenges. But more than that, we found actually that it's local elite preferences that really count, and particularly the connection between the incoming Chinese capital and local kind of preferences. So yes, while the Chinese actors did bring a kind of ignorance of regulatory standards, perhaps a different way of doing things when it comes to, sort of filling in all the boxes, reaching all the technical legal standards and so on. Really, we found that, it was the resolve of the whole state which was the make or break in any of these projects. So. And why is this important? Because, well, if either the EU or local civil society actors want to actually prevent some of these projects, which are doubtlessly not in the long-term interest, especially I'm talking about coal, right? Not in the interest of the Western Balkan states, they should really target the whole state. It's not about targeting Chinese investment. I mean, I've spoken earlier, we were speaking over tea, about, these are kind of things that you kind of hear on field work about Chinese embassy, Chinese companies actually expressing interest in building wind power plants and so on, and yet being rebuffed and sort of directed towards coal. So clearly, and you can ask yourself why that is. Well, coal is politically very important. It provides jobs in in a country like Bosnia, also I think electricity exports are one of the top exports for the country. So there is a kind of palpable sense that it is the host states that are actually directing a lot of this funding, rather than this being a kind of a big plan in Beijing. Certainly, there's a lot of opportunism. That is absolutely true. And lastly, we found that regional organizations have a fairly sort of anemic pressure. When it comes to, let's say, the energy community, they are simply understaffed. I spoke to a lot of people there, and it's sort of the issue is that they do not pursue any cases independently. They wait for local civil society actors to collect all the information, send it to Vienna, and then they can issue an opinion. And even after these opinions, they have no teeth with which to bite. Yeah. So that is ultimately the question here. So this should kind of sum up this synergy of failures. Yes, Chinese actors fail at things like assessment, compliance, and so on. But really, host government, is the lack of commitment. The problem for civil society actors is, however, that the way in which these negotiations work is that they produce very non-transparent deals. And then it's very difficult for civil society actors to intervene before these projects get a sort of momentum of their own, by which time, of course, everybody says, oh, this is already a kind of sunk cost. We must proceed, or otherwise we will lose all this effort, and so on. So really, it is about kind of transparency. And lastly, of course, the regional organizations I mentioned provide a quite weak incentive structure. So what we found is this is not so much a race to the bottom in terms of the, let's say, China exporting dirty technology, or Balkan countries racing to the bottom, but rather it's a kind of very unfortunate drift to the very lowest common denominator, which is lack of transparency, sort of disregard for regulatory standards and things like that. So then this big question, are Chinese actors influencing politics here? In a way they are by virtue of just being present, by actually enabling, let's call it, these practices that we might want to see disappear. But it's a question that nevertheless does not satisfy, let's say, the kind of high standard requirement, in my view, of whether this is a kind of geostrategic plan, whether China is actually actively influencing the decision making in these countries. Oftentimes it's a kind of a combination of opportunism and other things. Yeah. All right, thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Igor, for a fascinating case study there and two extremely rich and wide-ranging papers. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and room for discussion over the next half hour or so with our audience here. I might just start, if I could, with a couple of thoughts really about the questions that were raised first in Jens's paper at the beginning. Actually, your title, I should say, Economic or Political Interest. And of course, as you yourself point out, in some ways, the division is a slightly artificial one because, of course, the two things come into each other. And the element that I'd like to flag up and perhaps put on the table for discussion, and this is very relevant to issues such as energy supply and infrastructure as well, is essentially something that flowed from one of the comments made during Xi Jinping's visit with Prime Minister Mitsotakis in Greece, just November of last year, so 4 months ago. And amongst other things, my understanding was that in the speech she mentioned that Greece would become the Lungtao, the dragon's head, for the Belt and Road initiative. And interesting, and of course we should remind ourselves that in Chinese culture dragons are entirely benevolent and favourable and positive figures. So to refer to something with a dragon as a reference is not meant to be ambiguous in that sense, in a way that it might be in the English language context. But nonetheless, it did set me thinking as to what he meant by that. I'm sure he meant many things by it, but the thing that came to mind in the context of Southeastern Europe is that China's overall tactic, and I'm using the word tactic rather than strategy because I think you're right to question at this moment whether it's strategic in the sense of being planned in a sort of very thought-through way from Beijing, and I think the answer to that is no, not yet. But a very deliberate tactic is not, for the most part, to confront existing powers in areas where they are strong, There is a partial exception in its own backyard in the Asia Pacific in areas like the East and South China Sea. That is a slightly different sort of issue, I think, which we won't get into today, which has to do with China's sense of its own backyard. But in other areas, Latin America, Africa, and so forth, the tactic has been much more to find where there are relatively either ungoverned spaces or, in the case of Southeast Europe, which I think is different, areas that have some sort of commonalities and contiguities, but are not themselves regarded as whole and complete. And that gets, to some extent, I think, to your thought about the 16 or 17 plus 1 existing within the EU. You know, is it a subset? Is it a rival? Is it something slightly, you know, that question, where the Venn diagram overlaps. So when I was looking at the map, thinking about that visit of Xi to Greece, I was seeing that Dragon's Head and Piraeus in the Mediterranean as part of at least a tripartite set of port developments with different purposes, one of which, perhaps the longest standing one from China's point of view, with a decade or so behind it, is the Gwadar port of Pakistan, which of course will become a Dragon's Head also in terms of the passage into the west of China and the Central Asian landmass and South Asian landmass, and the establishment of China's first, but I suspect not last, formal overseas naval post in Djibouti on the East African coast, which of course is very close to what is becoming a rapidly increasing commercial port environment, particularly actually for goods from places like Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa in general. And the tactic of essentially finding ways to thicken the currently very thin control and governance of what is essentially the Mediterranean to Indian Ocean space, not strategically in the sense that I do not think there is yet a sense in Beijing, or at least my sense, obviously not being on an inside any policy discussions, is that this is more sort of marking territory for future developments than a plan that has a specific end point. But that way of thinking about the three ports, Piraeus, Djibouti, Gwadar, as part of a strategy that is both about economic interests, of course, but also about an inchoate and fluid security environment that China doesn't yet know exactly what it wants to do with. Because BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is of course an economic project, but we also know that all economic projects have security implications. And China doesn't yet know quite what it wants to do with those. So take that picture, I haven't seen it, it's a fabulous picture of the 2 or 3 Chinese policemen is it in Zagreb or in
Zagreb?
In
And
Zagreb.
the other one in Belgrade.
Okay. So, although this does not yet, I think, provide well, let me tell you what I'm referring to, and then you'll see the connection I would like to try and make slightly tentatively. One of the debates that is certainly going on in senior Chinese circles, and it's generally very closed and very private, is the question of how you securitize those economic interests. And the choices are all problematic in some ways. One is to provide, essentially send PLA, Chinese army troops, or naval officers, to protect interests. This works in some cases. The obvious place is off the Horn of Africa, where Chinese PLA Navy operates to try and make that ungoverned space a bit more governed. And that happens to some extent with UN cooperation in a place where nobody else has overall control, and therefore it's less problematic. I think it's fair to say that even in Greece, which I think has still a somewhat sunny view of aspects of Chinese investment, the offer to send the PLA Navy to patrol the Piraeus Port might not go down terribly well, and even if it did, NATO headquarters in Brussels might have something to say about that. Or, of course, there is the prospect of indigenizing your security, which is one of the things they've been trying in Pakistan, for instance, not least since 4 Chinese diplomats were shot by a kind of drive-by terrorist a few years ago, and certainly attacks on Chinese property and installations in Pakistan have become an increasingly urgent issue, and indigenous Pakistani security protection on that has proved a stopgap measure only. So the intervening position, and I think not a sustainable one, is the growth of Blackwater or Kroll type companies, Chinese private security firms, which are basically either recently retired or seconded PLA officers and troops, given a private label, but not really private in any sense we would understand that. And that's why the presence of the Chinese policeman in Zagreb struck me as an interesting side element to that particular version of what's going on. In other words, I think this is very much a project in motion.
Absolutely.
It changes,
Yes.
month by month, I think, let alone year by year. And I'll come back to you in a second. I may have comments on that. And just a comment to throw off the back of that to Igor as well. Energy dependency is clearly the very, very central element of the infrastructure part of this project, along, of course, actually with creating tech ecologies, so the bringing of Huawei and all those issues. And so the question, much more directly, that I have for you, Igor, is how far, if at all, do you see a linking between this highly and famously ecologically and environmentally unsound energy dissemination in Southeast Europe and promises or actualities of the installation of technological networks, and particularly 5G, but beyond that, basically upgrading capacity in those areas? And is there a sort of quid pro quo combo package that's being offered as part of that deal? So get brief thoughts from both of you on those.